Hello everybody, welcome to Endocrine System. We're starting off chapter 16. This video is called Endocrine 1, goes with your PowerPoint Endocrine 1. It'll be an introduction to the endocrine system. What is the endocrine system and what's the purpose? Well, how does our body know when to grow? How do our cells know when to divide? Cell-to-cell communication. You've got hormones that are traveling through the body that are informing cells when to divide, when to secrete other hormones even. All right, so cell-to-cell communication, we talked about that in the nervous system, didn't we? We had nerves traveling throughout the body, sometimes really long distances, and they had chemical signals, neurotransmitters, right? And do you remember way back in chapter 1, we talked about how the endocrine system uses chemical signals called hormones. So let's consider the nervous system versus the endocrine system. If you remember from Bio 141, the nervous system was the last thing that we discussed. So think back to about chapter 11 in the nervous system. So do nervous system and endocrine. Well, what's the big difference? The nervous system, those action potentials, are they slow or are they fast? They're fast, right? They're immediate. Endocrine system, well, it's not as fast. But how about the nervous system? Do the effects last a long time? You get that one action potential, it sends it down, and then what happens after that? If you don't get another action potential, your effects are terminated. So it's quickly terminated. The effects. You know, I should put that in there. How about the endocrine system? Well, in this case, the effects are going to last longer. So it takes a longer time to get it going, to get the effects to happen. But once you get that, it oftentimes, almost always lasts longer than the nervous system. So longer lasting. Right? These two really kind of go together. What about something else? Where does the nervous system secrete those neurotransmitters? Well, actually, let's back up. Let's say, what are neurotransmitters? They're chemical messengers, aren't they? That's a similarity. Because over here we have hormones, chemical messengers. Alright, so both use chemical messengers. But how far are these neurotransmitters traveling? Well, the nerve can go really far, but once the nerve releases those neurotransmitters, they're right there in the synaptic cleft, aren't they? So they don't travel very far themselves outside of the neuron. So
I had that, didn't
okay. And over here, how far does the endocrine system travel? Well, what happens with the endocrine is they get released right into the bloodstream. And once that happens, they can travel systemically throughout the body, really far. All right, so bloodstream. travel systemically in the bloodstream. And that's another difference, is where they're released. So here they're released into the synaptic cleft. Over here they're released not exactly into the bloodstream, into the interstitial fluid, and then take it up into the bloodstream. So enter. And interstitial fluid. Alright. Now something else. If this is traveling systemically, is it acting on every single cell all the time? How does a cell know? Oh, I want to respond to estrogen today. Oh, I'm going to respond to growth hormone. Well, we have receptors, and that's something that's the same between both of them. They both use receptors. Here, for hormones, I need a receptor for insulin. I need a receptor for estrogen. I need a receptor for thyroid hormone. Over here, I need a receptor for dopamine and serotonin and epinephrine. Interestingly, epinephrine we'll also discuss as a hormone. Alright, so let's circle the ones that are the same. Same. Chemical messengers. Alright guys, does that all make sense? Nervous system versus the endocrine system. And you can also see a diagram of this a bit, how it gets released into the interstitial fluid, taken up into the veins, taken to the heart, and then travels through the arteries. The first figure in chapter 16. Alright? Now let's talk about different types of hormone signaling. Alright, so we have 3 different types here that we want to talk about. We have our classic hormonal signaling. Alright. This one is traveling to a different cell type in a different organ. So you know what? Let's make a chart. Cell type. All right. So in hormonal signaling, we're going to a different cell type and a different organ. All right. For paracrine, we're going to a different cell type, but the same organ. Same organ, different cell type. All right. What about for autocrine? What do you think of auto? Automobile? Autonomous? Here we're doing same. And you guys, autocrine can even be the same cell. It can act on itself. Isn't that neat? Paracrine and autocrine, we'll talk more about these later in the semester. This chapter will focus more on hormonal signaling. Alright, so hormonal, different cell type, different organ. Paracrine, different cell type, same organ. Autocrine, same cell type, same organ, sometimes acting even on itself, like auto self. Does that make sense? All right, you can see figure, I think it's 16.2 in the textbook, details this. All right, let's move on. The key to all of those, by the way, is that it's getting released into the interstitial fluid and then acting on that. All right. So there's two different types of organs of hormonal endocrine organs. So you have the primary, and these only do endocrine functions, and then you have the secondary that also do other things, like the heart. Obviously, it's not just an endocrine organ, but the thyroid is. All right, so what do we have? I might not make a list here because you have the list there, and in your guided notes you could write it down. But you have your anterior pituitary. Interesting that they're not listing the posterior. We'll talk about that later. All right, and you have your thyroid gland. We've all heard of the thyroid, right? All right, your parathyroid gland. Did you talk about this in 141? We did, right? Chapter 6 with parathyroid hormone and the osteoclast and the calcium. The adrenal cortex. We'll talk about that a bit more later. But you guys have probably heard of cortisol and maybe even aldosterone. All right, and the endocrine pancreas. Does that sound silly? I'm not just saying pancreas because the pancreas has exocrine functions as well. And let's do a little bit on that. Endocrine. Versus exocrine. Endocrine, where is it getting secreted? Into the interstitial fluid, taken up into the bloodstream, right? Exocrine, do you guys remember this from chapter 5? We had exocrine glands. We talked a little bit about endocrine versus exocrine. There we were talking about sweat glands. But what about the pancreas? Does our pancreas sweat? No, pancreas doesn't sweat. But you know what? The pancreas does secrete some digestive enzymes and juices. Now, does it seem like, boy, isn't that going into the body? But it's really going into what we call the alimentary canal. We'll talk about that later. It's kind of external. It's not within the body. Right? It's going to this big tube that runs down through your body. So it's considered exocrine, the exocrine pancreas. The endocrine pancreas is considered endocrine. So, to a cavity. All right, so your pancreas has exocrine functions and endocrine. So let's do that. Let's do pancreas. Isn't that interesting? But the endocrine pancreas we're going to consider a primary endocrine organ. All right, in the thymus. We don't talk about it a ton, but in lab, we're going to need to identify that on our baby pics, our fetal pics. All right. And, all right. We also have some neuroendocrine organs. The hypothalamus. Do you guys remember hypothalamus from chapter 12? The hypothalamus is a big deal in the endocrine system. It's going to be really the regulator. It's going to oversee so many different hormones. We're going to talk about that in endocrine too. So the neuroendocrine organs are going to secrete neurohormones. So you have the pineal gland. Remember we talked about that one? in 141. And the adrenal medulla. Do you guys remember a little bit about epinephrine, norepinephrine? Here is where that comes in, the adrenal medulla. Alright, we'll talk about that today. But more in endocrine, I believe it's 4, that we talk about that one. Alright, now if you're following along in the PowerPoint, there's the paraneoplastic syndrome. The organs we just discussed are not the only ones that secrete hormones. You know what else does? Cancer cells can. And so sometimes when a hormone level is off, you can say, maybe you should take a look at this. I don't test on these A and P in the real world, but they make it more relevant and more interesting. So I think they're worth considering. All right, one of my favorite topics. We're going way back to chapter 2 here. Amino acid hormones versus steroid hormones. Now, tell me, what's an amino acid? Amino acid. Amino acid hormones versus steroid hormones. You know what? I don't like what colors I'm using here. I'm going to use blue amino acid. I'm going to do AA for amino acid and steroid I'll write out. Alright, so amino acids. Tell me about amino acids. What do they dissolve in? If I throw amino acids in oil, are they very happy there? Or are they going to dissolve better in water? They'll do better in water, won't they? So are they hydrophobic or hydrophilic? Hydrophilic. Steroids, hydrophobic or hydrophilic? Oh, let's talk about that. So steroids, right? They're all the steroid hormones made from cholesterol. So they have that common. Remember we talked about that in chapter 2, back in 141, how the cholesterol is the basis for all the steroid hormones. So hydrophobic. So, and steroids, like I just said, made from cholesterol. And over here, amino acids, peptides. Or proteins. All right. And so what else would make these different? For example, let's consider how would they travel in blood? Are amino acids happy to travel in blood? What is blood? Mostly water, right? Or plasma, which is mostly water. So these can travel just freely in the blood. All right, there's one exception here, so that's why I'm putting this asterisk. How about steroids? Can they travel in the blood? Does that work well for them? No. They need a transport protein. All right. I'll come back to the exception here later. Okay, and what else? So if the amino acids are hydrophilic, can they get through the plasma membrane? Can things that are hydrophilic get to the plasma membrane? Nope, they can't, right? Because of those the fatty acid tails. So these, how are they going to signal to the cell? What's something we could do? Do you remember those protein receptors, G protein receptors? The receptors, and then it binds to the G protein, right? And you have adenylate cyclase. That's what we're going to do here. So it binds receptor on plasma membrane. Cannot get into the cell. How about steroids? Can they get into the cell? They can, right? They can get through that plasma membrane. All right, so the steroid hormones can go into the cell. They bind an intracellular receptor, or even they can bind a receptor down in the DNA, on the DNA. Pass. Plasma membrane. Or nuclear. Alright, so they bind an intracellular receptor or a nuclear receptor. Something else. If this is water soluble, how's its half-life going to be? It's going to be shorter. It's going to get cleared faster. So a shorter half-life. Over here, steroid, hydrophobic. How's its half-life going to be? Also, consider this. It has a transport protein. Is it going to get broken down as easily if it has a transport protein? Nope.
Mommy.
All right. Now, I forgot to mention. Here, amino acids bind a receptor on the plasma membrane. We have another exception here. So let me put a little asterisk. All right. So here, travel free, there's one amino acid that doesn't. What would that one be? This is something that's going to travel bound. And this is the interesting part. It's not because necessarily that it has to, it's still hydrophilic. But what it really needs is you get this reservoir throughout the body. You've got this hormone hanging on to these transport proteins not getting broken down. What would I want a big reservoir of that I can call up? Growth hormone? Uses transport proteins. All right? And how about this one? Binds a receptor on the plasma membrane. There's an exception here. I really like this one. Oops, maybe I should do a different color. Thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone can pass through the plasma membrane and bind to an intracellular receptor. Actually, what I used to study this a little bit. It would dimerize with estrogen, so estrogen, thyroid hormone come together, bind, and initiate gene transcription in oligodendrocytes, if you remember those in the brain. Anyway, thyroid hormone can get to the plasma membrane. It's really small, and that's and it's a little bit less hydrophilic, but mostly it's really small. All right, does that make sense? Amino acid versus steroid, and look at how much structure of these, whether it's based on peptides or made from cholesterol, affects the function of it, right? I believe that you have a guided notes question on that. And I usually put that on an exam somewhere. All right, isn't that fun? Okay. Steroid hormones. Oh, and there's a figure in your PowerPoint where you can see it binding an intracellular receptor, going down to the DNA, initiating transcription, you get proteins made. All right. And then the do not enter sign, right? These, the amino acid hormones cannot enter the cell, but who can? Thyroid hormone. It's kind of like don't enter except for authorized vehicles. Thyroid hormone is the authorized vehicle. It can enter the cell. All right, but what do the rest do? They bind to that receptor. All right, activated G protein, adenylate cyclase, cyclic AMP, and you have the downward effects. All right. Now, these get released. They're traveling throughout the blood. Are they affecting every single cell all the time? No, right? Because of the receptors. We have target cells, and those target cells are like, oh, estrogen works on me. Estrogen works on me. Now, there's some hormones that would have more receptors on more cells. Like, how about insulin? Every cell's going to need some glucose, right? All right. So the mechanisms. The hydrophilic. If you look at picture, I don't know what picture number it is, but we have, it's in your textbook, you have the first messenger, which would be the hormone coming down, all right, binds to the receptor in the plasma membrane, all right, that activates the peripheral proteins, the G protein in the case of the picture in the textbook, and then that might activate an enzyme like adenylate cyclase, and then you get a second messenger like cyclic AMP. And then you can have protein kinases that would go out and do phosphorylation. And that would activate other proteins or molecules. All right? And then the next figure, I think it's number 22 in your PowerPoint, shows again the steroid hormone binding the intracellular receptor and then binding the DNA. There's a video to watch. I would recommend watching the video. I think pictures are great, but videos are even better. The video that the textbook put up, it's on the PowerPoint. All right. So does that make sense? Amino acid, steroid, their structure is affecting how they bind inside the cell. All right. So something else that's really interesting. So our cells just left there like, oh, it bound to me, I have to respond, right? They can also regulate their response a little bit, right? And the way they do that is, if you have one receptor, are you going to have a big response? What if you had 10? Well, what if you had 100, a million, right? The number of receptors can help determine the response of the cell. So the cell does a couple things. You can have upregulation. Upregulation. So this is when the cell makes more receptors, so it can have a greater response to the hormone. This will happen more if it hasn't seen the hormone in a while. If there are low levels of the hormone, you may have upregulation of the receptor. So what does that actually mean? It's actually making more of these proteins and putting them in the cell membrane for the hormone to come bind to. Does that make sense? So right? And how about if there's upregulation, what are we going to have? Downregulation. It's the opposite. Less receptors are made and are inserted in the plasma membrane. Now, when would this happen? Maybe if there was a lot of that hormone circulating all the time. They would say, you know what, we don't need all these receptors. We have a really good response to this hormone already. The hormone would be binding much more frequently if there's a lot of that hormone, right? You know what I think of this as? This makes me think of cell phones and being able to block. So, am I gonna block someone that never calls me? Why bother, right? But what if someone's calling all the time? That's when I would. Oh, sorry, I'm doing this backwards. All right, am I gonna block someone that never calls? No, right? When am I gonna down-regulate or block a call? If I'm getting called all the time, right? So. Same thing, upregulation. So let's say I haven't heard from my best friend in a few months, and then she calls, and I'm like, oh, this is great, you know, or I know she's going to call. I'd be checking my phone quite a bit, saying like, oh, did you call? So this would be, you have a good friend, doesn't call too often, you check your phone, or maybe you say, oh, you check your email, give your email out. You can email me, you can call me. You have more receptors out there for getting the message. Does that make sense? For upregulation, downregulation, blocking the call, less receptors in the plasma membrane. Upregulation, more receptors. And so I really love this because you don't just have the hormone causing the response, you have the cells themselves saying, you know, I haven't seen this hormone in a while, or, oh, I'm seeing too much of this, I'm having too much of a response. The cells themselves can help regulate this. Pretty awesome. All right. Well, but what do they do anyway? What do these cells do? These hormones. What kind of effects are they going to have? All right. Well, I'll let you look at the list on the PowerPoint. They can stimulate the endocrine or exocrine even cell. So what does that mean? That means they're going to say, hey, release this gastric juice. Release this hormone. So they can also activate enzymes, or they could inhibit enzymes. Remember we talked about that phosphorylation, right? They can stimulate or inhibit mitosis or meiosis. So how do cells know when to divide? Who do you think's doing that? Which hormone? Well, one of them, not the only one, but one of them is growth hormone. Maybe that's somewhat obvious, right? Kind of fun. You can open and close ion channels in the plasma membrane, and so you can alter the membrane potential, which is pretty neat, right? We've talked about membrane potentials, being able to alter that through a hormone. It's quite interesting, isn't it? All right, and activating genes that would, well, obviously code for RNA and proteins. So gene transcription. All right, hormone interactions. Oh, and you know what, you guys? You have that hormone interaction chart. Fill it out. I don't grade that one. I don't recall why I made it. I think some people wanted it a couple years ago. But it is kind of fun. So take a look at it. Fill it out as we go through. But what I want you to know, we have something called synergists and antagonists. Synergists and antagonists. All right. Have you guys ever taken a literature course? What does an antagonist do? Is that the person that's doing the good thing? Is that remember protagonist and antagonist there? The antagonist is acting against the main character usually, right? So same thing here. An antagonist, you have this hormone doing its job. Antagonist is doing the opposite thing, saying, nope, nope, I'm going to do the opposite. Why? Homeostasis, right? We need to have a balance. How about synergists? This one's doing its thing. Oh, this one kind of has some of the similar effects. So when you're filling out your chart, think about that. Think about, oh, do these have like a similar action? Or do they have a different action? What's an example? Antagonist? Well, how about glucagon and insulin. Glucagon raises blood sugar and insulin lowers blood sugar. Don't worry, we'll talk about that later. And synergists, well, some other hormones may act to help raise blood sugar. Let's say epinephrine and your stress hormones would. Oh, better example. So scratch that. Here's a better example. Blood pressure. So we do not want our blood pressure getting too low. Think about it 1,000 years ago, right? Before we had a high salt diet, low blood pressure was a real concern. So our body has a lot of different ways of keeping our blood pressure from dropping too low. All right, so you have angiotensin 2, and you have ADH, antidiuretic hormones. So those two would be synergists. All right, does that make sense? And the mechanisms, we talked about that. So you had synergists, antagonists, and that's your hormone interaction chart. When does it stop? Well, half-life and elimination, right? Everything has an end. So it depends on a couple different things. What do you think would affect the half-life? Well, for one thing, how quickly it's cleared from the body, right? Removed from the blood. But also, how much is produced, right? If you're making a lot, but you're not clearing a lot, then you would have a lot, right? If you're not making much, and you're clearing an average amount, you still wouldn't have much. Does that make sense? So, you're making a lot, you're clearing, or making that much. You could be clearing at the same rate. But depending on how much you're producing, would affect how much is in the blood. But also, if you're producing the same level and all of a sudden you're clearing it faster or slower, that would affect how much is in the blood. All right, and which one has a longer half-life? Amino acids or steroids? Steroid hormones, right? Partly because they're bound to those transport proteins. All right, let's talk about some methods of stimulation. And as we go through the different hormones after this, I'm going to ask you to keep these in mind. Consider what kind of stimulation they are. All right, hormonal. Hormonal stimulation of a hormone. Interesting, right? So what's happening here? You've got a hormone coming down, acting on a cell. That cell releases a different hormone. So different hormone. We see this quite a bit. So hormone tells the cell to secrete a different hormone that it makes. All right. We have humoral. Oops, I should have done this one in red. Humoral. Is that a funny term? It's so close to hormonal. So guys, be really careful. Hormonal, humoral, not the same. Humoral is coming from a long ago Latin word for blood. If you've read Shakespeare, you may have heard of the humors. They thought people's personality depended on their blood type or something like that. So humoral is referring to blood, and what's happening is the cells are testing the the content in the blood. So let's say parathyroid hormone. Remember we talked about that back in chapter 6? So parathyroid hormone says, oh, blood calcium is a little low. It is sampling the blood itself. And it says, okay, I know I need to release this parathyroid hormone. So parathyroid, sampling the blood, releases parathyroid hormone. Stimulated by change in blood levels, blood chemistry. Whether that's glucose levels or calcium levels, it's changed, stimulated by a change in the blood, the chemicals in the blood. All right, and neural stimulation. Let's do green. So neural stimulation, what would that be? Well, sounds like nerves, right? Remember we talked about how the adrenal medulla, the nerves come down, synapse there, and it releases. You're also going to have the posterior pituitary. Remember we talked about the pituitary? It was an identification thing on your lab charts in 141. So neural, stimulated by a nerve. So the nerve stimulates the cell releases, let's say, epinephrine. Does that make sense? Hormonal, humoral, neural. People usually remember neural. Hormonal, remember it's a hormone signaling to the cell to release its hormone. Here, humoral, those cells are sampling the blood and say, oh, glucose is low, or oh, glucose is high, oh, calcium is low. Does that make sense? Okay. And then hormones have a feedback loop. Remember we talked about that all semester last in 141. How the stimulus, the receptor, the control center, the effector that does the response, and you return back to homeostatic range. So let's take calcium. Calcium goes low. Parathyroid hormone or parathyroid gland cells realize that, and they release parathyroid hormone, and that's gonna tell the osteoclasts to do more bone resorption. It's going to affect the small intestine and say, hey, let's absorb more calcium. It's going to affect the kidney and say, oh, you know what, let's reabsorb more calcium. And so what's happening is you're conserving, you're taking in more, getting rid of less, and pulling from your calcium bank in your bones. So that increases your blood calcium, and you get back to homeostatic range. Does that make sense? All right, thanks for sitting through this video. And this is hormone or endocrine 1, an intro to the endocrine hormones, basically, and their general properties. We'll talk about the different organs in future videos. Thanks for hanging in there through all this change. All right. See you guys later.